The town had been waiting for it all year. Every spring, the streets came alive with the Easter parade, a tradition older than most of the storefronts lining Main Street. On that morning, pastel floats rolled slowly past cheering families. Brass bands filled the air with familiar songs. Children clutched woven baskets, darting from curb to curb in search of candy tossed by performers. It was the kind of day where everyone felt safe, where neighbors waved to neighbors, and parents let their children run a little further ahead than usual. 9-year-old Ethan Walker was one of those children. He wore his favorite blue jacket, one his mother had insisted he keep on, even though the sun was already warming the streets. His hair was slightly messy from running, his small hand clutching the edge of a basket nearly overflowing with foil-wrapped chocolate eggs. To anyone watching, Ethan looked like any other child caught up in the excitement of the parade, weaving in and out of the crowd with a big smile across his face. His parents, Michael and Laura, stayed close enough to keep him in sight, but not so close as to spoil his independence. They had come early, claimed a good spot along the route, and were surrounded by dozens of other families doing the same. For them, it was supposed to be a perfect holiday morning, a chance to forget about bills, responsibilities, and the everyday stress of life. Laura later described it as the happiest she had seen her son in weeks. But in the middle of all that joy, something happened that nobody noticed at first. The band passed and floats shaped like giant rabbits drifted down the street, the sound of clapping and laughter echoing against the storefronts. For a brief moment, Ethan stepped ahead, drawn by a group of older kids sprinting after a burst of candy. His father remembered seeing him disappear into a moving wave of people just a few feet away, nothing unusual at first. But when the crowd shifted and the children scattered, Ethan didn't come running back. At first, there was no panic. His parents looked around, expecting to see him reappear from behind another family or standing on his toes trying to spot them. Michael scanned the faces, Laura called his name, but seconds stretched into minutes, and Ethan still wasn't there. The first pang of worry hit when Laura realized she couldn't see his blue jacket anywhere. She thought perhaps he had followed the older children down a side street, or maybe he had been swept up closer to the floats. They split up, circling the block, expecting him to emerge at any second. But every turn revealed only strangers, other children with baskets, none of them Ethan. By the time they returned to the original spot, both were pale and shaken. Michael tried to steady his wife, telling her Ethan had probably gotten turned around and would walk right back. But 10 minutes passed. Then 15. They began shouting his name above the music. Neighbors and strangers joined in, scanning the crowd. Someone notified parade security. The atmosphere of celebration cracked. Police officers already stationed at the parade were quickly alerted. Officers radioed in descriptions, one repeating over and over, 9-year-old boy, blue jacket, brown hair, last seen near the corner of Main and Jefferson. A command post was set up within minutes, but the sheer number of people in the streets made searching almost impossible. Witnesses came forward, each with a slightly different account. One woman thought she saw a boy being led away by a man in a baseball cap. Another insisted Ethan had simply darted toward the candy and vanished into the chaos. Dozens of tips flooded in, but none were consistent. Officers stopped cars at roadblocks, scanning back seats. Others fanned out into nearby alleys and parking lots. Helicopters were even requested, circling overhead to watch for a child wandering away from the town center. Despite the rapid response, the Walker family's nightmare deepened with every passing minute. Laura broke down in tears as officers questioned her about Ethan's height, weight, and distinguishing features. Michael's voice trembled as he described his son's jacket, the basket he was carrying, and how he had only looked away for a moment. Both clung to each other, their faces pale under the spring sunlight that only hours earlier had felt so warm. By the end of the parade, music and laughter had given way to silence and tension. Floats rolled to a halt, candy remained scattered on the pavement, and families whispered uneasily to one another. The celebration had ended, replaced by a growing sense of dread spreading through the crowd. Something unthinkable had happened in broad daylight, in the middle of a holiday gathering, and nobody seemed to have seen it clearly enough to explain. As night fell, the streets that had been filled with color and joy were cordoned off with yellow tape. Flashlights cut through the darkness as officers combed through every alley, yard, and dumpster in the surrounding blocks. Loudspeakers echoed Ethan's name. Volunteers carried lanterns, calling into the night, hoping for a voice to answer. But the town was met with silence. In a matter of hours, the Walkers' perfect Easter morning had collapsed into a chilling reality. Their son was gone, swallowed by the crowd without a trace, and no one could explain how. It was the beginning of one of the most disturbing cases the town would ever face, and in those first desperate hours, no one could have imagined how long the nightmare would last or how dark the trail would eventually become. The hours immediately following Ethan Walker's disappearance were marked by a frenzy of motion, the kind of desperate urgency that only comes when a child is missing. Local detectives were called in within minutes. By late afternoon, the quiet Midwestern town that had hosted a cheerful Easter parade was suddenly overwhelmed with patrol, cars, investigators, and volunteers. Officers moved quickly, understanding what every missing child investigation teaches. The first 48 hours are critical, and beyond that, the odds of recovery diminish sharply. Detectives began their work by retracing the family's steps. They asked Michael and Laura to recount, minute by minute, where they had been standing, who had been nearby, when they last saw Ethan's face. Their words stumbled, their memories already blurring under the weight of panic. Ethan had been only a few feet away, they repeated, his blue jacket visible in the crowd. He had looked happy, energized, and then gone. That was the only truth they could cling to. Witness statements were gathered from parade-goers who lingered long after the floats had passed. Some swore they had seen Ethan dart into the street chasing candy. Others insisted they saw him walking with a man, but details conflicted. One person thought the man wore a baseball cap. Another remembered sunglasses. A third claimed the boy seemed hesitant, as if resisting. The descriptions overlapped and contradicted, until investigators had a dozen versions of what might have happened, but no consistency strong enough to act on. Meanwhile, detectives scoured every frame of amateur camcorder footage. Families had been recording the parade, capturing shaky handheld images of floats, costumes, and music. Investigators played the tapes back slowly, searching for Ethan's blue jacket in the background. On some recordings, they thought they caught glimpses of him, but the crowd shifted too quickly, heads and shoulders blocking any clear view. Nothing revealed who he might have been near in those final moments. As daylight faded, search dogs were brought in. Handlers presented Ethan's pillowcase from home, allowing the animals to catch his scent. The dogs pulled hard at their leashes, weaving through side streets, cutting across lawns, their noses close to the ground. For hours, handlers followed them across alleys and fields. At one point, the dogs stopped near the edge of a parking lot, circling, barking, then losing the trail as if it had abruptly vanished. Investigators marked the spot but found no physical evidence to explain the dogs' sudden confusion. Inside the command post set up near Main Street, a large map of the town was pinned to the wall, dotted with colored markers. Each represented a sighting, a tip, a potential lead. The map grew cluttered quickly, but not one of those markers provided a definitive path. Detectives knew that with every hour passing, the chance of finding Ethan safe decreased. The Walkers appeared on local television late that night. Exhausted, pale, and trembling, they pleaded with the community for help. Laura's voice cracked as she begged anyone who had seen her son to come forward, to look again through photographs, to search their yards and garages. Michael sat beside her, his hand gripping hers tightly, his jaw set in determination. The broadcast was replayed every hour, reaching homes across the state, turning Ethan's face into a symbol of heartbreak. Rumors began spreading almost immediately. Some whispered that a man had been seen offering candy to children at the edge of the parade route. Others claimed a suspicious vehicle had been parked near the park where floats were lined up. In small towns, gossip travels faster than fact, and soon the detectives were chasing dozens of stories, most of them leading nowhere. Reporters descended on the town, their vans lined along Main Street. Cameras captured the frantic search, the tearful volunteers, the flashing police lights. Every newscast repeated the same description: a 9-year-old boy, last seen in a blue jacket, brown hair, carrying a basket. Neighbors who had once left their doors unlocked now triple-checked them, and parents refused to let their children out of sight. Despite the scale of the search, no solid leads surfaced. Officers questioned known offenders in the area, checking alibis, searching vehicles, examining homes. Nothing connected back to Ethan. They interviewed parade vendors, the people running the floats, even members of the band. Each denied seeing anything unusual. It was as if Ethan had stepped into the crowd and disappeared into thin air. By the second day, fatigue set in. Officers who had worked through the night leaned on car hoods, drinking stale coffee, their eyes bloodshot. Volunteers' voices grew hoarse from shouting Ethan's name. Still, nobody gave up. The hope that he might appear, frightened but alive, drove them forward. Yet as hours ticked by, the tone shifted. The urgency was no longer only about finding a lost boy. It was about racing against the possibility that something far worse had happened. Detectives began to feel the walls closing in. The descriptions of a man leading Ethan away were troubling but unprovable. The lack of physical evidence was maddening, and the small details they did have, a possible car, a vague clothing description, a patchy dog trail, offered no clear direction. Every path seemed to lead to silence. That silence weighed on the community. The Easter parade had always been a celebration, but now it was remembered only for what had been lost. Families kept their children indoors, the town square felt empty, and conversations everywhere circled back to the same haunting question: how could a child vanish in broad daylight, surrounded by hundreds of witnesses? By the end of the first 48 hours, detectives were left with nothing concrete. No suspect in custody, no definitive sighting, no trace of Ethan beyond the last moment his parents saw him. It was a void, an absence that grew larger with every passing minute. And though the search would continue, those first 2 days ended with a chilling realization. The boy in the blue jacket was not simply lost. Something deliberate had happened, and whatever it was, the person responsible had vanished as completely as Ethan himself. The third day of the search for Ethan Walker brought with it a heavier silence across the town. What had begun as frantic energy slowly shifted into something more methodical and grim. Detectives widened the search perimeter, no longer focusing only on the parade route, but pushing outward into fields, wooded edges, and the neglected industrial lots on the outskirts of town. Volunteers who had once walked shoulder to shoulder now fanned out in measured lines, combing every ditch and clearing. Helicopters circled overhead, their rotors thundering across neighborhoods as infrared scanners swept for heat signatures. On the ground, officers poked through brush with long poles, careful not to miss even the smallest detail. Canvassing teams knocked on doors, sometimes met with neighbors eager to help, other times greeted with suspicion. Each resident was asked the same questions. Did you see Ethan? Did you notice anything unusual that morning? Did a stranger knock on your door? And though many claimed they wanted to help, almost none could provide information of value. Still, hope clung to the idea that a detail overlooked in the chaos might resurface now. A man recalled seeing a candy wrapper fluttering near the creek bed that matched the type handed out during the parade. Investigators seized it, bagging the wrapper, logging it into evidence, and rushing it to the lab. Hours later, results showed nothing. No fingerprints, no traceable DNA. Just a discarded wrapper carried by the wind. A similar moment of hope came when a volunteer discovered a small child's shoe in the grass near an abandoned warehouse. Forensic technicians surrounded it, photographing, measuring, and placing it carefully into a sealed container. When the walkers were shown the shoe, Laura collapsed, certain it belonged to Ethan. But testing revealed it was not his size, and neighbors remembered a family picnic days before where children had been playing nearby. Another false lead, another emotional collapse for the parents. With each discarded clue, the emotional toll deepened. Families that once banded together began to fracture under the pressure. Rumors spread through the community. Some whispered that law enforcement was withholding information, that someone in town knew more than they were admitting. Others suggested Ethan's parents themselves were being investigated, pointing to their strained marriage as evidence. Detectives dismissed the speculation, but they could not stop its spread. Forensic science offered little clarity. Soil samples from the parking lot where the dogs had lost Ethan's scent were examined, but the results were inconclusive. Fibers found in a drainage ditch turned out to be from an old rug. Even surveillance cameras offered little help. Most stores near the parade route had aging systems that recorded over themselves every 24 hours, and by the time investigators requested footage, valuable frames were gone. What remained showed only crowds of people, indistinct faces, blurs of motion, nothing that identified Ethan or anyone who might have taken him. As the days turned into weeks, the official tone of the investigation shifted. Detectives began to speak less about a lost child and more about a likely abduction. It was the only explanation that fit the timeline. A boy doesn't simply vanish from a crowded parade without someone deliberately removing him. Yet, without physical evidence, the theory remained unproven, a haunting possibility rather than a confirmed fact. The Walker family clung to each press conference, their faces etched with exhaustion. Michael tried to project strength, standing beside officers, urging the public not to give up. Laura grew quieter, her voice breaking whenever she spoke of her son. They attended prayer vigils, candlelight gatherings where hundreds stood in silence, holding photographs of Ethan's smiling face. These gatherings were meant to unite, but underneath, fear crept in. Parents pulled their children close. Neighbors eyed one another with unease. The idea that someone responsible could be living among them poisoned the atmosphere. Police resources began to thin. Detectives worked long shifts, but without fresh leads, the manpower stretched further than it could sustain. The town's streets were blanketed with posters of Ethan's face, but even those began to fade in the sun, curling at the corners, blending into the background of everyday life. Investigators reached beyond the town, coordinating with state police and federal agents. The FBI provided a profile. If Ethan had been abducted, the suspect was likely someone familiar with the area, possibly someone who had attended the parade before. It could be a person who blended into the community, unnoticed, patient. This profile offered chilling confirmation of what many already feared. The threat might not have come from a stranger passing through, but from someone far closer to home. As weeks slipped by, the investigation reached a fragile breaking point. Each new search yielded objects that raised hope, only to shatter it hours later. Each door knocked on ended in the same polite but unhelpful denial. Every lab test returned inconclusive. The town was exhausted, detectives were drained, and the Walker family was left oscillating between fragile hope and unbearable grief. By the end of the first month, Ethan Walker's disappearance was no longer treated as a temporary emergency. It had become something far more ominous, a case where time itself seemed to work against any resolution. Detectives now whispered the word that no parent ever wants to hear attached to their child's name: cold. The realization set in slowly, almost reluctantly. But beneath every unanswered question, every fruitless lead, there was one haunting truth that no one could ignore. If Ethan had been taken, the person responsible had executed their plan with terrifying precision. And if they had done it once, nothing guaranteed they wouldn't do it again. As the weeks passed and the search for Ethan Walker stalled, investigators shifted their focus from frantic ground searches to something colder, sharper, and far more unsettling: the people themselves. If Ethan had been taken, then someone had done it, and that meant somewhere within the crowds of familiar faces lay a predator who had blended in unnoticed. Detectives began narrowing their attention to a small number of individuals whose movements during the parade raised more questions than answers. The first was a vendor who had worked the parade route selling balloons and toys. On the surface, he seemed harmless, even cheerful, his cart bright with colors. But his background check revealed prior offenses, non-violent, but unsettling enough to warrant closer inspection. He had been charged years earlier with inappropriate behavior toward minors at a county fair, though the case never led to conviction. When detectives pulled him in for questioning, he appeared nervous, fidgeting under the fluorescent lights. He admitted to working near the section where Ethan's family had been standing, and admitted he remembered seeing a boy in a blue jacket. But when pressed for details, who Ethan was with, whether he had walked away with anyone, the man's answers grew vague, inconsistent, like someone who wanted to be helpful but was terrified of implication. His alibi was weak, but not non-existent. Other vendors vouched that he stayed in his cart most of the day. Without evidence tying him directly to Ethan, suspicion could not become proof. The second person of interest struck closer to home, and his involvement cut the community to its core. He was a neighbor, someone the Walkers knew casually, who had shown up at search efforts in the early days, volunteering his time. At first, his participation felt supportive, but soon his behavior seemed odd. He offered theories unprompted, repeated details about Ethan's appearance with eerie precision, and gave detectives conflicting stories about where he had been during the parade. When asked directly, he placed himself at a completely different location than what other neighbors recalled. That inconsistency made investigators uneasy. They brought him in for extended questioning, probing every detail of his day. He grew defensive, insisting he was being framed by gossip, reminding them he had been one of the first to volunteer in the search. Still, the cracks in his alibi lingered. Detectives quietly monitored his movements for weeks, but surveillance revealed nothing unusual. Suspicion was heavy, but evidence remained non-existent. The third suspect was harder to track because he had no ties to the community. He was described by multiple witnesses as a drifter, seen loitering near the park in the days leading up to the parade. He had been spotted sitting on a bench, sometimes talking to himself, sometimes approaching children with casual conversation. When police tried to locate him afterward, he had vanished. A sketch artist worked with witnesses to create a composite which circulated in the media. Tips flooded in, placing the man in half a dozen states, but none verified. He became more ghost than suspect, an unsettling reminder that a stranger could come and go without leaving a trace. Each of these leads carried weight, each contained moments of chilling possibility. Yet none held the hard evidence investigators needed. No fibers, no fingerprints, no DNA, no eyewitness testimony strong enough to withstand the scrutiny of a courtroom. The case balanced on shadows, suspicion filling the gaps where proof should have been. The longer this dragged on, the more paranoia seeped into everyday life. Families who had once trusted one another began to look with narrowed eyes. Parents pulled children from neighborhood playdates, whispering about who might have had access to them. Rumors spread like wildfire about the vendor, about the neighbor, about people entirely uninvolved. Some claimed to have seen suspicious vehicles parked near schools. Others suspected law enforcement wasn't telling the whole truth. Within homes, the pressure was no less suffocating. Friendships that had once defined the small town frayed under suspicion. A mother accused her longtime friend of withholding information. A father refused to let his children near families who had been questioned by police. Marriages strained as spouses disagreed over whom they trusted. Ethan's case was no longer just a search for a missing boy. It had become a mirror reflecting every fear people tried to suppress. Detectives continued interrogations, bringing suspects back again and again. Each time, details emerged that were unsettling but inconclusive. The vendor admitted he had once followed children after work, though he claimed it was only curiosity. The neighbor confessed to lying about his whereabouts, explaining he didn't want his wife to know he had been drinking that morning. The drifter, when finally spotted weeks later in another county, denied ever being in the town at all, though he matched the description eerily well. None of it solidified into the undeniable truth investigators needed. By now, the Walker family lived under constant scrutiny. Michael and Laura endured whispers questioning their parenting, even their potential involvement. Though police cleared them early, small-town suspicion is harder to silence than any official statement. Every public appearance brought stares. Every moment outside their home reminded them they were living in the center of a storm they could not control. And still, the case refused to break. Detectives chased shadows, interrogated possible suspects, and tested every theory, only to return to the same void they had faced since the day Ethan vanished. Each interview ended with more unease than answers. Each suspect slipped back into the world, technically innocent, but never fully cleared in the eyes of the community. By the third month of the investigation, the once tight town had turned into a place defined by suspicion and fear. Friendships dissolved, families withdrew. The parade that had always symbolized joy now existed only as the backdrop to a nightmare no one could forget. Detectives faced the same haunting question over and over. Had they spoken to the person responsible and simply failed to recognize it? As the list of suspects thinned and tips dried up, one reality began to settle in, heavy and undeniable. Without new evidence, without a break in the silence, the case would not move forward. And as investigators faced the growing possibility of a dead end, the nightmare of Ethan Walker's disappearance began its slow descent toward something far more devastating. A cold case. Months slipped by, and with each one, the urgency of the search for Ethan Walker began to fade. What had once consumed every headline and dominated nightly broadcasts was slowly replaced by other stories, other tragedies that captured the public's attention. The boy in the blue jacket who had vanished during the Easter parade was still missing, but he no longer held the spotlight. For Michael and Laura, however, every single day remained the same, a blur of unanswered questions, sleepless nights, and the crushing silence of a house missing its child. The investigation that had begun with helicopters, search dogs, and a flood of volunteers grew smaller with time. By the end of the first year, only a handful of detectives still actively worked the case. Their files grew thicker with each passing month, filled with reports, dead-end leads, and interviews that all seemed to circle back to nothing. The three main suspects had not been eliminated, but none could be tied directly to Ethan's disappearance. Without new evidence, prosecutors had no grounds to push forward, and detectives were forced to admit quietly that the trail had gone cold. The Walkers' marriage suffered under the relentless weight of grief. In the early days, they had leaned on one another, united in their desperation to find their son. But grief rarely moves in unison. Michael tried to bury himself in work, shutting down emotionally, clinging to the hope that investigators would eventually bring answers. Laura, on the other hand, lived and breathed the search. She attended every meeting, kept in contact with officers, and joined support groups for parents of missing children. Their coping mechanisms clashed. Arguments grew sharper, silence heavier. Within 3 years of Ethan's disappearance, the couple divorced. To outsiders, it seemed inevitable. To Laura and Michael, it felt like losing the last piece of stability they had left. The town itself began to heal, but only on the surface. The Easter parade returned the following spring, though it was smaller, quieter, overshadowed by the Yatu, memory of the child who had vanished in plain sight. Parents kept their children closer. Some refused to attend altogether, unable to walk the same streets where Ethan had last been seen. In conversations, his name was spoken less often, but when it was, it carried a heavy pause. Ethan Walker had become a whispered reminder of fragility, a symbol of how quickly joy could be stolen. Inside the police department, the case file grew dusty. Detectives rotated in and out of the force. Some retired, others transferred. With each departure, the details of Ethan's disappearance faded a little more into the background. The box labeled Walker Case was stored in the evidence room, a collection of reports, photographs, and items that once seemed like they might lead to a breakthrough. Now it sat on a shelf among dozens of other boxes, indistinguishable from the rest except for the fading ink of its label. For Laura, life became defined by a ritual of grief. She left Ethan's room untouched, his toys and books preserved exactly as they had been. Every birthday, she placed a candle in the window, a silent beacon to a boy who never returned. She kept in contact with organizations for missing children, occasionally traveling to speak about Ethan's case, using her pain to keep his name alive in whatever way she could. Yet, even she admitted privately that her hope had thinned. She clung less to the possibility of a reunion and more to the desperate need for answers, any answers at all. Michael moved away from the town, unable to withstand the stares and the memories. He remarried years later, though he carried the same haunted look whenever Ethan's name was mentioned. Friends described him as a man who had compartmentalized his pain, sealing it off in order to function, though the wound was still visible in the rare moments when he let his guard down. The years blurred. New tragedies filled the airwaves, natural disasters, accidents, other missing children whose names became new headlines. Ethan's face, once plastered across every lamppost and television screen, faded from public memory. The posters curled, the photographs yellowed. Only in the quiet spaces of his parents' lives did his absence remain as sharp as it had been the day he disappeared. Detectives occasionally reopened the file when a new tip came in. Once, a caller claimed to have seen a boy matching Ethan's description at a gas station in another state. Another time, a letter arrived suggesting he had been taken by a traveling carnival worker. Each lead was investigated, each ended the same: false sightings, misinformation, or cruel hoaxes. The disappointment each time cut deeper, reinforcing the reality that the case was slipping further from resolution. For the community, Ethan's disappearance became less of an active wound and more of a shadow that lingered over holidays and parades. Parents taught their children not to wander, citing Ethan as a cautionary tale. Teachers referenced him when warning students about strangers. The story became less about a boy and more about a lesson, a transformation that carried its own kind of tragedy. And yet, beneath the dust and the silence, the case never fully disappeared. The box labeled Walker Case remained, its contents waiting, silent and patient. Investigators, both old and new, occasionally glanced at it as they passed the evidence shelves, reminded of the case they could never solve. They spoke about it quietly among themselves, admitting the strangeness, the frustration, the sheer impossibility of a boy vanishing in front of hundreds of witnesses without leaving a trace. It was a story that haunted them, even as their careers moved on. Because every detective knew one thing with certainty: someone, somewhere, still knew what had happened to Ethan Walker. And though years continued to pass, that truth hung in the air, unresolved, waiting for the day when the silence might finally be broken. 11 years had passed since the Easter parade. Ethan Walker's case had become a cold echo of the past, a story most in town remembered but rarely spoke aloud. Life had gone on. New families moved into old homes, new children played on the sidewalks, and the parade returned each spring with cautious smiles. For most, the memory had dulled. But in the fall of that 11th year, the silence surrounding Ethan's disappearance was broken in the most unexpected way. It started with a repossessed storage unit. The renter had fallen behind on payments, and by law, the contents were auctioned off to the highest bidder. These auctions were rarely remarkable. Most units held nothing more than broken furniture, boxes of clothes, or forgotten holiday decorations. But when a local man purchased one of these units, he discovered something he hadn't anticipated. Toward the back, beneath old mattresses and boxes of dishes, sat a heavy wooden chest. It was scratched and worn, with a lock rusted from years of neglect. Curiosity drove him to pry it open. Inside, he found not valuables, but a collection of children's belongings. At first glance, it seemed like a box of keepsakes, a small assortment of toys, crayon drawings, and folded clothes. But one item in particular stopped him cold. It was a child's blue jacket, small in size, with faint stains at the collar. The man couldn't place why, but something about it felt unsettling, wrong to be hidden away like this. He contacted authorities, explaining his discovery. Detectives arrived, photographed the contents, and carefully bagged each item. When they saw the jacket, their expressions hardened. They remembered. They had seen that jacket before. Back at the station, they pulled out old case files. Within minutes, photographs of 9-year-old Ethan Walker were spread across a table. In nearly every image from that Easter morning, he wore the same jacket. Side-by-side comparison left no doubt. The garment from the storage chest was Ethan's. The weight of the discovery rippled through the department. For over a decade, the Walker case had lingered in the background, unsolved, a constant reminder of failure. Now, a single wooden chest had cracked the silence wide open. Detectives logged the jacket into evidence, treating it with the care reserved for something that might finally unravel the mystery. The stains near the collar were tested, and initial results revealed traces of human blood. News of the discovery traveled quickly. For the Walker family, it reopened wounds that had never healed. Laura, who had spent years keeping Ethan's memory alive, was devastated. The jacket was undeniable proof of her son's suffering, a chilling artifact that stripped away even the faintest hope he might still be alive. Michael, quieter and more restrained, described feeling a mix of grief and fury. For years they had lived in limbo. Now, the chest suggested answers, but not the ones they had prayed for. The storage unit itself became the center of intense scrutiny. Investigators traced rental records, hoping to learn who had placed the chest there. But the trail was complex. The unit had changed hands multiple times, rented under aliases and prepaid cards. Detectives tracked down the most recent renter, but he denied knowledge of the chest, insisting it had been there when he acquired the space. His story seemed plausible, yet it added another layer of frustration. The chest had survived for more than a decade, passing unnoticed from one person to another, carrying with it the silent weight of Ethan's case. Forensic teams scoured the wooden box, swabbing for fingerprints, hair, or anything that might identify who had handled it. Small fragments of dust and fibers were collected, bagged, and sent to labs. Detectives compared the child's drawings and toys with items known to have belonged to Ethan, searching for personal identifiers. Some of the sketches appeared hauntingly familiar. Stick figures that resembled his family, crude outlines of a house with a yard. Though not definitive, they strongly suggested the box had been tied directly to him. The discovery reignited not only the investigation, but the entire community. News outlets returned, broadcasting images of the chest, the jacket, and the reopened case file. For residents, it was a chilling reminder that the mystery they had pushed into the background was far from over. Parents who had relaxed over the years now pulled their children close again. Conversations reopened, theories reignited, and once again, suspicions spread across the town like wildfire. Detectives were cautious. They understood the gravity of the chest, but also the danger of building a case on artifacts without context. The question remained, who had hidden it, and why? Was it a trophy kept by the person who had taken Ethan, or was it planted, stored deliberately to mislead investigators? The possibilities were endless, and each one carried its own disturbing implications. For Laura, the jacket became more than evidence. It was a devastating symbol of finality. She had clung to hope for 11 years, but now she held proof that her son had been harmed. In interviews, her voice trembled as she described running her fingers over the fabric, recognizing every detail, every worn seam, every trace of him. For Michael, the discovery reignited anger at the unknown person who had stolen their child and kept this secret hidden for more than a decade. The chest was transported to the evidence room, its presence altering the entire landscape of the case. Detectives who had long since moved on from Ethan's disappearance returned to re-examine old notes. Younger officers who had only heard of the case now pored over the files with fresh eyes. The Walker case was no longer a dusty box on a forgotten shelf. It was active, urgent, alive again. And yet, for all the weight the chest carried, it offered no simple answers. It reopened the wound, provided undeniable proof that Ethan had been taken, and proved he had likely been hurt. But it did not reveal who was responsible or why, or where he had been in those missing years. Instead, it left investigators staring into the same darkness they had faced over a decade earlier. Only now, that darkness was deeper, and the stakes had become even more haunting. The discovery of the wooden chest changed everything. For investigators who had quietly resigned themselves to an unsolved case, it was a jolt of energy. For the Walker family, it was devastation in its most tangible form. The blue jacket, once worn proudly by Ethan on a spring morning, was now more than just a piece of clothing. It was evidence, and the stains along its collar whispered a truth no parent once confirmed. Detectives wasted no time reopening the files that had sat dormant for over a decade. Boxes were pulled from storage, photographs spread out across desks, and reports reread with new urgency. Forensic technology had advanced in the years since Ethan's disappearance, and what once yielded no results could now be tested again. The jacket became the centerpiece. Under powerful equipment, faint traces of blood were detected, so faint they had gone unnoticed before. When compared against Ethan's DNA, preserved from baby teeth his mother had kept, the match was undeniable. The garment proved he had been injured, and likely fatally. For Laura Walker, the results destroyed the last fragile thread of hope she had carried. For years she had spoken at vigils, telling herself Ethan might be alive somewhere, waiting to come home. She had clung to the idea that his disappearance had left possibilities open, no matter how unlikely. But the jacket closed those doors. It told her that her son's suffering had been real, and that she would never see him again. In interviews, her voice cracked as she admitted that hope was gone. Michael, by then living in another city, reacted with fury. He said the discovery did not give him closure, only rage at the idea that the person responsible had kept this secret locked away for 11 years. The town reacted in its own way. Old fears resurfaced overnight. Parents who had begun to relax their grip on their children once again refused to let them out of sight. Neighbors eyed each other with suspicion. Theories spread like wildfire, whispered in kitchens and gas stations, traded online in chat forums dedicated to unsolved crimes. Who had owned the storage unit? How could the chest have sat unnoticed for so long? And most disturbingly, why had someone kept those items instead of destroying them? Detectives turned back to the suspects who had been scrutinized during the original investigation. The vendor who had worked the parade was tracked down, older now, living quietly in another state. He was interviewed again, this time confronted with the fact that Ethan's belongings had resurfaced. His denial remained firm. He insisted he had never been near the child that day, never seen him leave the crowd. The neighbor who had once offered shifting alibis was also re-questioned. His story, too, remained the same, though his discomfort was visible. And the drifter, long suspected and long vanished, remained a ghost. No trace of him ever conclusively tied to Ethan, no new leads about his whereabouts. Every interview ended the same way it had years before, with frustration, suspicion, and no definitive evidence. Investigators logged the details, but they could not move forward without something more concrete. The storage unit became the focus. Detectives combed through its rental history, tracing every payment, every listed name. But the trail wound through aliases, prepaid cards, and people who claimed to have no memory of the box. Each lead seemed to dissolve just as it appeared. The most recent renter insisted he had nothing to do with the chest and had assumed it belonged to someone before him. His story could not be disproven, but it also could not explain why a child's possessions had been locked away for more than a decade. For the community, the renewed investigation was both a relief and a burden. On one hand, the discovery breathed life into a case many believed forgotten. On the other, it reopened wounds people had spent years trying to close. Candlelight vigils returned, the faces of Ethan's classmates now older, some with children of their own, standing in silence with flickering lights in their hands. But along with the grief came paranoia. Families began to speculate not just about strangers, but about each other. The idea that someone within the community might have kept the chest, might have lived quietly among them while hiding the truth, became impossible to shake. Investigators leaned on forensic science for answers. They examined the toys and drawings, hoping for fingerprints, skin cells, anything to connect the chest to a living person. But the items had aged poorly. The wooden box itself carried hundreds of partial prints, none of them clear enough to identify. Dust and time had blurred what might once have been damning evidence. Still, detectives refused to let the trail die again. They sought help from federal agents, hoping national databases might reveal something overlooked before. Old tips were revisited, Witnesses re-interviewed, surveillance footage from that long-ago day reviewed once more. But the truth remained maddeningly elusive. The jacket provided proof of Ethan's fate, but not the identity of the one responsible. For Laura, the reawakened case became a cruel cycle of emotions. Every news story that mentioned the chest brought reporters to her door. Every vigil ended with someone asking if she finally had closure. She said closure was impossible without knowing who had taken her child and why. For Michael, the discovery deepened his resolve to see justice done, though years of distance made him wary of placing hope in the system again. The chest had changed the narrative. Ethan's disappearance was no longer a mystery of whether he had been taken, but a chilling question of who had kept his belongings hidden for 11 years, and whether that person still walked free among them. The wooden chest had brought Ethan Walker's case back to life, but for detectives, the key to unlocking the mystery lay not in the jacket itself, but in the paper trail left behind. Every storage unit leaves a record, contracts, payment receipts, addresses on file. Investigators turned their attention to the facility where the chest had been found, combing through over a decade of documentation in the hope of uncovering the person who had hidden it away. At first, the record seemed straightforward. The unit had been registered under a name that sounded plausible, ordinary even. But when detectives dug deeper, they realized the identity was fabricated. The driver's license used to rent the unit had been counterfeit, the address on the form traced back to an abandoned house 2 towns over. Payments had been made in cash or through prepaid debit cards, the kind designed to avoid leaving a trace. Whoever had stored the chest had gone to deliberate lengths to remain hidden. Detectives subpoenaed financial records tied to the prepaid cards, tracing them through scattered purchases. The transactions were small and ordinary: grocery stores, gas stations, and the occasional pawn shop. But one detail stood out. Several payments had been made within a short distance of the town where Ethan had lived. It wasn't proof, but it suggested something chilling. The person who had hidden Ethan's belongings wasn't a stranger passing through. They had been close enough, long enough, to maintain a presence in the community. Every lead was pursued with urgency. Pawn slips were collected, receipts examined, traffic tickets cross-referenced against names from the old suspect list. Investigators worked with the hope that one of these fragments might finally connect the chest to a living person. But the deeper they dug, the more elusive the trail became. Transactions ended abruptly. The prepaid cards went inactive. The pawn shops had records of small sales, tools, electronics, nothing distinctive, and none of the signatures matched anyone already tied to the case. Still, there were hints. A ticket issued near the state line belonged to a vehicle registered to a man who had once lived within walking distance of the Walkers. His name had appeared briefly in early reports, dismissed after he provided an alibi. Now, years later, his proximity to both the storage unit and the family raised fresh suspicions. Detectives interviewed him again, but he insisted the ticket was a coincidence, explaining he had borrowed the car to visit relatives. His story checked out just enough to avoid charges, leaving investigators with yet another lead that slipped through their fingers. The silence surrounding the chest was suffocating. Each time investigators thought they had reached a breakthrough, the trail dissolved into ambiguity. It was as if someone had carefully planted a series of false markers, always keeping themselves one step removed from exposure. Detectives began to question whether the storage unit had been chosen for its anonymity, its paper trail deliberately designed to frustrate anyone who came looking. For the town, the implications were disturbing. If the person responsible had lived among them all those years, then every friendly wave, every neighborly smile might have masked something darker. People began revisiting old memories, questioning interactions they had long forgotten. That man who lingered at the park too long, the neighbor who moved away suddenly, the co-worker who had once asked strange questions, all became potential suspects in the minds of a community desperate for answers. Detectives worked long hours, sifting through stacks of files that seemed to multiply instead of shrink. The work was painstaking, built on fragments that never seemed to fit together. Each day ended with more paper on the desk than when it began. They interviewed former employees of the storage facility, hoping someone might remember the person who had rented the unit. A few recalled vague impressions, someone tall, someone quiet, someone who kept their head down. But none of the descriptions matched well enough to build a profile. The federal agents brought in to assist described the situation as one of calculated invisibility. Whoever rented that unit had known exactly how to avoid leaving a digital or paper footprint strong enough to follow. It wasn't sloppiness that left the trail incomplete. It was intentional. That suggested planning, patience, and familiarity with how investigations unfolded. It suggested someone who had hidden in plain sight and succeeded for over a decade. The Walker family followed the developments with heavy hearts. Laura attended every briefing she was allowed into, her face drawn, her voice edged with quiet exhaustion. Each new lead brought a flicker of hope, followed swiftly by crushing disappointment when it fell apart. Michael, more distant, admitted privately that he no longer expected closure, only the truth about why someone had preserved their son's belongings in such a way. The case, once again, seemed to teeter on the edge of collapse. Every piece of paper hinted at someone close, someone ordinary, yet every attempt to pin down that identity fell apart in the details. Detectives admitted in interviews that it felt like chasing a shadow, something always there, always visible at the edge of vision, but impossible to catch. And as the chest sat sealed in evidence, its contents preserved under lock and key, it became a symbol of both hope and despair. Hope that somewhere in its fibers, its scratches, its history, lay the answer to Ethan's disappearance. Despair that even with modern forensics, seasoned investigators, and years of searching, the silence it carried remained unbroken. By the end of the renewed investigation's first year, detectives were left with more questions than answers. They had traced a trail of paper that suggested someone familiar, someone tied to the community, but never firmly enough to reveal a name. The silence around the chest seemed deliberate, mocking, as if the person responsible had built walls of uncertainty that no one could tear down. And though the Walker family longed for resolution, the haunting truth remained the same. The jacket had given them proof of loss, the chest had reopened the mystery. But the person who had placed it there, the one who had hidden in plain sight, still walked free, their identity just out of reach, cloaked in silence. In the absence of answers, the vacuum around Ethan Walker's case filled with theories. Experts, locals, and strangers on the internet all tried to explain how a boy could vanish in front of hundreds of witnesses and why his belongings surfaced more than a decade later. Some clung to the idea of an opportunistic abduction, a stranger seizing a brief moment of chaos during the Easter parade. The theory accounted for the suddenness of Ethan's disappearance, but skeptics pointed out that impulsive offenders rarely keep trophies for years, much less hide them in a chest. Others believed the truth lay closer to home. They whispered that only someone Ethan trusted could have led him away so easily. A neighbor, a family acquaintance, someone who blended into the background. The effort put into renting a storage unit under false identities suggested planning and familiarity with the community, not the randomness of a drifter. For many, this was the most chilling possibility, that the offender had walked among them all along. Federal profilers added another perspective. The chest, with its drawings, toys, and jacket, fit a disturbing behavioral pattern. The collector. Offenders who keep trophies preserve them as tokens of power and control, revisiting the objects as a way of reliving the crime. The fact that Ethan's belongings remained intact for over a decade suggested obsession, not impulse. But even the profilers could not answer the central question: why now? Why had the chest surfaced only after 11 years? Online communities dissected every angle. Some were convinced the chest had been planted deliberately to taunt investigators or redirect suspicion. Others linked the discovery to unsolved cases in nearby states, speculating about a serial predator who passed quietly through towns, leaving behind shattered families. Every theory gathered followers, but none could be proved. For the Walker family, the speculation was another form of torment, Laura admitted she no longer cared which theory was correct. She only wanted to know who had taken her son and why. Michael, quieter, believed the chest's timing was no accident, though he couldn't explain its purpose, and that was the cruel reality. Theories multiplied, but none provided the truth. The chest had reopened the case, but it had not solved it. Instead, it left investigators and the community staring into the same silence they had faced all along, haunted by possibilities, but still waiting for answers. The renewed investigation gave the appearance of momentum, but within months, the same old pattern returned. Leads that once seemed promising withered in the face of evidence that refused to materialize. Ownership records dead-ended, suspects denied involvement, and the wooden chest offered no further clues beyond the grim confirmation of Ethan's suffering. What began with urgency slowed into the familiar rhythm of stalled progress, the case once again slipping into silence. For Laura Walker, the chest did not bring answers, it brought a new kind of torment. During interviews, she held her son's blue jacket in her lap, fingers tracing the seams, eyes fixed on something distant. She admitted it was all she had left of him, and though the fabric was worn and stained, it was tangible, unlike the endless theories that had circled for years. Michael, more private, described his grief as permanent, saying justice felt less likely with every passing season. The discovery had reignited the pain, but not the resolution. Detectives acknowledged the limits they faced. In press briefings, they urged anyone with information, no matter how small, to come forward. They reminded the public that cases are only cold until a single detail breaks them open, and that silence, even after 11 years, could be shattered in an instant if the right person spoke. Yet behind the official statements lay a quieter admission. Ethan Walker's case might never be solved. The town settled back into its uneasy rhythm, living with a story that had become part of its identity. The Easter parade still went on, but it carried a shadow. Parents pulled children close. People glanced at their neighbors a little too long, and the memory of a boy in a blue jacket lingered in every cautious step. The chest remained in evidence, sealed and preserved, a haunting reminder that someone had kept those belongings for more than a decade. It proved Ethan's disappearance was not a moment of chance, but a deliberate act carried out by someone who had hidden in plain sight. And though the trail had grown cold again, one truth endured. Someone out there still knows what happened to Ethan Walker.